My sister ruined my relationship just because she couldn't have the man she wanted, so I decided to make her watch him fall for me instead. Stay with me while I tell you exactly how it happened. And if you're hooked, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a story of betrayal and payback. Her name is Ivy. To most people, she's the picture of charm, warm smile, polite laugh, always knowing just what to say. But I know better. Beneath that polished surface is someone who can't stand to see others happy, someone who sees love not as a feeling, but as a game she has to win. For years, that game circled around a man named Liam. She met him once at a party, and in her mind that brief meeting turned into a grand romance. She told anyone who would listen that Liam was her soulmate, stolen from her by cruel circumstances. In truth, Liam barely remembered her name, but the fantasy fed her, and she guarded it fiercely. I learned long ago to keep my own love life far away from her reach. If she couldn't have what she wanted, she'd make sure no one else enjoyed it either. That's why I kept Noah a secret for 2 years. It wasn't about hiding him out of shame. It was about protecting what we had from Ivy's games. Everything was fine until my father's birthday dinner. We were seated around a long table, voices blending with the clink of glasses. Noah's hand rested gently on my leg under the table. Across from us, Ivy laughed with my cousins, but I caught her eyes flicking toward us again and again. I don't even know why I said it. Maybe it was the warm glow of the moment. Maybe I was tired of keeping it in. I told my family that Noah and I were engaged. The reaction was instant. Cheers, hugs, my mother's eyes brimming with tears. And then Ivy's smile. It wasn't the smile of a sister happy for me. It was thin, deliberate, like she'd just spotted her next move. She raised her glass and said, "Congratulations," but her voice had a strange edge. Later, as we left, she brushed past me and murmured, "Hope he's nothing like Liam." I knew then, the storm was coming. And with Ivy, it never came quietly. It started with little things, a notification here, a strange message there. Noah showed me the first one evening, holding out his phone with a laugh. The profile picture was a blurry flower, the name a jumble of letters, but the tone of the message was odd. "I know who you really are," it read. "You don't belong with her. You're meant for someone else." We laughed about it, brushed it off. Internet weirdos weren't rare, and Noah wasn't the kind of man to take them seriously. But the messages kept coming. Each one was more personal, slipping in details about his job, his routines, even a pair of sneakers he'd bought the week before. A few nights later, another message popped up, this time from a different account, but the same tone. And then another. We started joking about his mystery admirer, but deep down I could feel a strange unease curling in my stomach. I didn't say anything. Not until the day my phone buzzed with a text from Marcy, my oldest friend. "Why is Noah's car parked outside Ivy's place?" The words sat on the screen, cold and impossible to ignore. I was at home, wrapped in a blanket, recovering from a nasty flu. Noah had told me he was running errands, maybe grabbing some soup for me. My reply to Marcy was short. "Are you sure?" She sent back a picture. Noah's car, parked right in front of Ivy's apartment building. The blanket fell away as I stood. I didn't think about what I was wearing. I didn't think about the fever still lingering in my body. I grabbed my keys and drove. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and gold, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. By the time I pulled up, the street was quiet. No sign of Noah outside. I climbed the stairs, my hand steady on the railing, and knocked once. The door opened almost instantly. Ivy stood there, her hair messy, a thin robe hanging loosely from her shoulders. And there was Noah, sitting on the couch, his head bowed, not in guilt, but in some strange stillness. Her hand was in his hair, like she'd been comforting him, or maybe claiming him. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us was thick, almost buzzing. Then Ivy's eyes widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "Clara, it's not." Her voice broke into a trembling whisper. He reminds me of Liam." I didn't mean for it to happen. The tears came next. Perfect, practiced tears that slid down her cheeks in delicate lines. I'd seen them before. The same tears she'd used to convince friends she hadn't meant to steal their boyfriend, that she was the real victim in some twisted misunderstanding. I didn't say a word. Noah looked at me then, but he didn't stand. He didn't follow when I turned to leave. He didn't call my name. That silence told me everything I needed to know. By the time I reached my car, the air outside felt cold and clean. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. If Ivy thought she'd won, she was wrong. She'd just shown me her weakest point, and I was going to make sure she finally understood what it meant to lose. By the time I went to bed that night, my decision was already made. I wasn't going to waste energy crying over Ivy's latest victory. If she wanted to play, I'd play better. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I'd never had a reason to use before, Liam. We'd never been close, just friendly enough to nod at each other across a room at mutual friends' parties, the kind of connection that survives on polite smiles and the occasional comment on a photo. But that was enough. He knew who I was, and I knew exactly who he was to Ivy. The message I typed was short and without sugarcoat. Ivy's been obsessed with you for years. She's just destroyed my relationship over it. I think it's time she knows what losing feels like. Interested? I expected hours, maybe days, before he replied. Instead, my phone buzzed almost immediately. I believe you. I've got proof. What followed was a stream of screenshots and stories that made my skin crawl. Fake accounts she'd used to send him messages, photos of him at events she hadn't attended, rumors she'd spread to mutual acquaintances to make herself seem closer to him than she was. There was even a text from her to his brother, pretending she was invited to a family barbecue. By the time he was done, there was no need for me to explain further. He'd lived his own version of Ivy's madness. He understood. So what do you have in mind? He asked. I told him. Slowly. Calmly. No rushing, no cheap stunts. We would give her exactly what she had wanted all these years, except it wouldn't be her in the picture. It would be me. And it wouldn't be fake to her eyes. Every move would feel real, believable, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. He didn't hesitate. In fact, there was almost a smile in his voice when he said, All right, let's make it happen. We started laying out the first steps. A public appearance together, somewhere Ivy was bound to hear about. Nothing flashy, just enough to plant the seed. A couple of photos on social media after that, casual and unforced. Let her imagination fill in the blanks. Let her think she was seeing something intimate grow between us. It was a strange kind of alliance, built not on friendship, but on shared history with the same storm. When we ended the call, I realized my hands were steady for the first time in days. Ivy thought she'd pulled off her greatest move. She had no idea she'd just set the stage for mine. The week before my father's birthday, Liam and I met twice to prepare. It wasn't about pretending to be in love. It was about making it look like second nature. The way his hand would rest lightly on the small of my back. How I'd lean into him when he spoke. The unthinking glances, the private smiles, the little moments that speak louder than any declaration. By the time the day came, we didn't need to speak in the car on the way over. The plan was set. I could feel the weight of it between us, a quiet readiness. The restaurant was buzzing when we walked in. My father's milestone birthday had drawn every branch of the family tree, along with a few friends I hadn't seen in years. The room was warm with laughter and the clink of glasses, a sea of familiar faces. Liam's fingers laced through mine as we stepped forward. We moved as one, the picture of an easy, unforced connection. I could see heads turning before we even reached the table. And then I saw her. Ivy was mid-laugh, her head thrown back, some cousin hanging on her words. But when her eyes landed on us, the sound stopped. The smile didn't disappear. Not completely, but it shifted, tightened, like something had snapped into place behind her eye. We took our seats, Liam close beside me, his arm brushing mine as he leaned in to ask if I was warm enough. His voice was low, meant just for me. The intimacy of it wasn't forced. It was practiced, polished, as if we'd been doing it for years. Every time I glanced up, I caught Ivy watching. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered too long to be casual. She tried, of course, to pull herself into the space between us, leaning across the table with some question for Liam, asking about his work, his weekend plan. Each time, Liam's answer was brief, polite, and ended with him turning back to me. A hand over mine. A soft right, Clara? As if my opinion sealed the matter. The more she tried, the clearer it became that she wasn't in control. Her stories landed flat. Her laughter felt brittle. I could almost see the calculation running behind her eyes, the frantic search for a move she could make to shift the attention back to herself. By dessert, she'd disappeared. I knew where she'd gone before I even asked. The bathroom was quiet, the soft hum of music from the dining room muted by the walls. She stood at the mirror, dabbing at her lipstick with a tissue. When she saw me in the reflection, her mouth twitched into something like a smile. Just fixing up. Big night for Dad. I stepped closer, my voice steady. Don't waste your energy, Ivy. You're not the star tonight. Her eyes flicked to mine in the mirror, a flicker of challenge there. I leaned in just enough that she could feel the words as much as hear them. Stay in your seat. Watch quietly. That's all you get. I left her there, the scent of her expensive perfume clinging to the air, and walked back into the warm hum of the party. Liam was waiting, his hand resting casually on my chair. As I sat, he smiled at me like nothing had happened. Ivy didn't speak to either of us for the rest of the night. It started with a single picture. Nothing staged, nothing posed. Just Liam and me at a corner table of a small cafe, sunlight slipping through the window and catching the curve of his smile. His hand rested on mine, the kind of moment you don't think about until later. He posted it one quiet Sunday afternoon. No caption, just a coffee cup emoji and a heart. Within minutes, likes began stacking up. Friends, acquaintances, people from the fringes of our lives all dropped hearts and warm comments. Ivy saw it within the hour. Her comment appeared beneath the photo like a spark in dry grass. So you've stolen the man meant for me? How long have you been sneaking around, Clara? I read it twice, my jaw tightening. The tone was classic Ivy, dramatic enough to catch attention, accusatory enough to make people curious. She'd thrown bait into the water. Liam didn't wait. His reply came swiftly, his words sharp and unflinching. We met once. That's it. What followed wasn't love. It was you showing up where I was uninvited, sending messages from fake accounts, and trying to convince my family we were together. That's not fate. That's obsession. The thread exploded. People who'd seen her antics over the years began chiming in. A girl from our old school mentioned how Ivy had borrowed her boyfriend for a summer, then acted like she'd done her a favor. Someone else recalled a work event where Ivy claimed a senior partner was secretly dating her, despite him being married for decades. The stories piled up fast, each one more detailed than the last. Screenshots surfaced, snippets of her late-night texts, half flirtation, half threat. An old neighbor commented about the time Ivy had left flowers on a man's porch with a note claiming they were soulmates, even though he'd just moved in the week before. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The crowd had taken over, each comment chipping away at the careful image she'd built over the years. By evening, the post had doubled in reach. People were sharing it to their own pages, tagging friends with comments like, "Remember when she did this to you?" And guess she's at it again. I imagined Ivy at home, phone in hand, watching her control over the narrative slip through her fingers. She'd always relied on the fact that her victims stayed quiet, too embarrassed or too drained to fight back. Now they had an open stage and a willing audience. The next day, I noticed something different. Mutual acquaintances who'd once greeted her with eager smiles now scrolled past her posts without a word. A few unfollowed her entirely. A local boutique she often collaborated with quietly removed her from their page. It wasn't just the loss of image. It was the loss of the illusion she'd wrapped herself in. People were starting to see her not as the charming, unlucky romantic she liked to play, but as someone who thrived on taking what wasn't hers. Liam didn't bring up the post again. He didn't need to. It had done exactly what we'd intended, planted a crack in her reputation, deep enough that it would keep spreading on its own. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was playing defense. I was watching the tide turn. Then came the kind of night Ivy would have killed to be part of. An exclusive restaurant opening in the city's most coveted district, velvet ropes, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and cameras flashing at every arrival. Liam had been invited through a friend of the owner, and I was on his arm before we even stepped out of the car. From the moment we walked in, it was as if the room decided we belonged at its center. Photographers caught us under the chandeliers, Liam's hand resting at my waist, my fingers lightly hooked in his jacket. Later, I'd see one of those shots tagged on the restaurant's official page with the caption, "The couple of the night." We moved through the crowd without effort, greeted by familiar faces from Liam's circle. Laughter came easily, and every small touch between us, a hand brushing mine, the way he leaned in to speak, was noticed. The entire evening unfolded like it had been designed to be seen. I didn't need to check to know Ivy had seen it before midnight. By the next morning, I heard from a friend that she'd tried her usual tactic, a cryptic Instagram story showing the restaurant's exterior with the words, "Some people will do anything for attention." It vanished into the feed almost instantly, drowned by glowing write-ups and reposted photos from the night, ours among the most shared. If the opening was the spark, my cousin's wedding was where the fire caught. The ceremony was held on the grounds of an old estate, sunlight spilling across manicured lawns and white silk drapes swaying in the breeze. Guests mingled between the ceremony and reception, drinks in hand, music humming low in the background. That's when Ivy made her move. I saw her cross the lawn toward Liam, her posture soft, her smile angled just right, the same expression she'd worn every time she thought she could charm her way in. She reached him, touching his arm, leaning close as if to draw him into some private moment. I started toward them, but Liam's voice carried before I was halfway there. "I'm busy loving your sister," he said, warm and clear enough for the nearby guests to hear. The silence that followed was quick but sharp. A few people glanced at one another. One smiled discreetly. Ivy's expression didn't falter immediately, but the flush rising in her cheeks betrayed her. She straightened, muttered something low, and turned away. Her heels caught once in the grass as she walked back toward the reception tent, and she didn't look back. She didn't try again for the rest of the evening. No sudden appearances, no sidelong remarks, no subtle tests. By the time dessert was served, she was gone, leaving before the cake was cut, slipping out into the night without a goodbye. It was the first time I'd seen her retreat so completely. The first time she seemed to understand there was nothing left for her to take. It started as an idea I wasn't sure I'd follow through on. A friend I trusted had been urging me to share what happened, not with names, not to target anyone, but to talk about patterns, about people who twist love into control, and how families sometimes protect them. I agreed, but only because the setting felt safe. The host was someone I'd followed for years, a voice I knew from long walks and long drives. Her show was known for exploring the darker corners of relationships without turning them into gossip fodder. She asked if I wanted to change details, blur timelines, keep things untraceable. I told her yes to all of it. We recorded in a quiet studio with a single microphone between us. I spoke about manipulation disguised as care, about trust chipped away piece by piece. I described the way a person can build an entire fantasy and demand the world bend to it. I didn't use Ivy's name. I didn't need to. The story was sharp enough without specifics. When the episode aired, I expected a ripple at most, a few messages from listeners who'd been through something similar. Instead, it spread like a dropped match in dry grass. Within days, it was climbing charts, shared in group chats and on timelines with captions like "you have to hear this one." The comment sections were a mix of outrage and recognition. Some people debated the ethics of exposing a family member, even without names. Others shared pieces of their own lives that mirrored mine in uncomfortable detail. The thread that ran through it all was clear. People wanted to talk about it, and they weren't holding back. Ivy noticed. I knew before she said a word because her feed began to shift. One day she was posting a brunch table covered in mimosas. The next, she was uploading a series of close-up selfies, eyes glassy, captions vague but heavy. Some wounds never heal. Being misunderstood is the worst pain. It might have worked once. People might have flooded her comments with sympathy, offering comfort without asking questions. But the air around her had changed. The replies were polite, restrained. Some were curious in ways she wouldn't like. Is this about that podcast everyone's talking about? Others came from people who'd clearly been holding back for years. Stories began to surface in the replies. A woman she'd worked with mentioned a strange incident at an office party. A former neighbor hinted about late-night visits to someone else's boyfriend. The trickle became a steady flow, each comment carrying a piece of the puzzle. By the second week, the shift was unmistakable. A brand she'd modeled for quietly replaced her photo on their site. A boutique that had invited her to every launch in the last 2 years suddenly stopped tagging her. Even the local charity gala, the one she never missed, sent out their guest list without her name on it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching it happen was less about satisfaction and more about a strange, steady quiet settling in. For years, she'd held her grip on the people around her through performance and charm. Now, the mask was slipping, and no amount of curated photos could hold it in place. The podcast kept circulating, reaching new ears week after week. And while Ivy kept posting, the responses grew fewer, the silence between them louder. It had been months since I'd last thought of Noah as anything but a closed chapter. Life had moved forward, cleaner without his shadow in it. That's why seeing his name light up on my phone felt so strange. Not painful, just unexpected, like stumbling across an old jacket you'd forgotten you owned. The message was simple. Can we meet? Just to talk. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit for a day, then another, weighing whether there was any point. In the end, I agreed. Curiosity, maybe. Or the quiet satisfaction of knowing I wasn't the one who needed answers anymore. We met at a small cafe downtown, one I knew wouldn't be crowded on a weekday afternoon. He was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone lukewarm from waiting. When he saw me, he stood too quickly, as if the right posture might make up for the past. "Thanks for coming," he said, and his voice was softer than I remembered. We sat, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then the words started spilling from him. He told me how Ivy had come to him, how she'd told him things about me, pieces of truth warped out of shape, stories I'd trusted her with years ago twisted until they were unrecognized. She'd backed them up with evidence. Old photos taken out of context, messages cropped to change their meaning. "She made it sound like you'd been lying to me since the start," he admitted, his hands flexing against the mug. "Like you weren't who I thought you were." I listened without interrupting. There was no point in correcting every false detail. He already knew the truth now, and if he hadn't seen it then, that was on him. "She's good at what she does," I said finally, my voice even. "But you chose to believe her." His eyes flicked down. "I know, and I'm sorry. I should have talked to you, I should have." He stopped, shaking his head. "I just wanted you to hear it from me, that it wasn't you. It was her." There was a time when those words might have mattered. Now they were just air between us. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. And I meant it. Not because it fixed anything, but because it confirmed what I'd already known. The trust we'd had was gone, and there was no pulling it back. We sat a little longer, talking about nothing. The weather, work, the way the city seemed to have grown noisier since winter. When it was time to leave, he reached for my hand across the table. "I hope you're happy," he said, and I could tell he meant it in that half-hopeful way people do when they're wondering if there's still space for them. I slid my hand back and stood. "I am," I said simply. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that clears your head. I walked away without looking over my shoulder, not because I needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left to see. The chapter had closed long ago. This was just the final sentence. It was strange how the quiet, after everything, felt heavier than the chaos itself. Weeks had passed without hearing from my parents, and I'd started to think they'd chosen silence over taking sides. Then out of nowhere, my mother called. She didn't start with small talk. "No, how are you?" No weather report, just a pause so long I thought the line had dropped. And then, "I need to say something I should have said years ago." I could hear her pacing, the faint creak of the hallway floorboards at their house. She told me she'd been thinking about all the times Ivy had caused trouble, how she'd brushed it off, smoothed it over, or found a way to make it seem less than it was. She admitted she'd believed Ivy's versions of events too quickly, too often, because Ivy demanded to be heard while I didn't. "You always seemed fine," she said, almost pleading. "You never needed us the way she did." I let her speak. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her that needing someone and showing it aren't the same thing. But I stayed quiet, because I wanted to hear her say the rest. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for letting her hurt you and pretending it wasn't happening." The call ended without resolution, but I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. It wasn't enough to undo years, but it was the first crack in a wall I'd thought was permanent. A few days later, my father showed up at my door. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down, as if the last few months had pulled the fight out of him. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He just stood there holding his hat like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "I've been wrong," he said, before I could even ask why he was there. "I thought keeping the peace meant letting her be, well, her. But it meant letting her take from you over and over." He talked about the years of family dinners where Ivy's jabs were dismissed as teasing, the birthdays where she found a way to turn attention her way, the countless times I'd been left to handle myself while they focused on containing her storm. "You didn't need us because you didn't ask," he said, his voice breaking. "But we should have been there anyway." It was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I'd ever heard from. I told them both the same thing separately. I heard their apologies. I understood they were trying, but I couldn't pretend the damage wasn't still there. If we were going to move forward, there would be rules. I wouldn't be dragged into rooms with Ivy. I wouldn't be asked to just be civil for the sake of the family. I wouldn't sit quietly while old habits repeated themselves. They both agreed, at least in words. Whether they'd follow through, I didn't know yet. When they left, my father down the walkway, my mother's voice fading over the phone, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the sense that maybe the past didn't have to be the blueprint for the future. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was setting the terms, and that in itself was enough for now. The sharp edges of those months had softened with time. What started as a calculated alliance had shifted without either of us really noticing. Liam wasn't just the man who'd helped me pull off a plan. He'd become the person I looked for in a crowded room, the one whose presence felt like steady ground. We never talked about when it changed. There wasn't a single moment, no grand confession. It was in the way he showed up without asking if he should, the way he remembered the smallest details I'd mentioned in passing, the way his laugh filled the quiet. Somewhere between stage dinners and public appearances, the act stopped being an act. Life with him was quieter now. No audience, no deliberate displays, just the rhythm of two people learning each other without urgency. He'd cook while I worked at the kitchen table, tossing in ridiculous commentary about his culinary genius. I'd leave my book to watch him talk, hands moving as if he were explaining the secrets of the universe when it was really just pasta. Ivy's name came up less and less. News reached me in fragments. She'd moved to another city, started over. Whether she left to escape the fallout or because she couldn't stand the sight of me and Liam together, I didn't know. And honestly, I didn't care. Her shadow no longer stretched into my life. I used to think victory would feel like standing over the ruins of what she'd built, making sure she knew who had put her there. But when the chance for that satisfaction came, it didn't feel necessary anymore. She was gone, and I had something better than her acknowledgement of defeat, a life that wasn't defined by her at all. Liam didn't push me to talk about her. He seemed to know that the silence around Ivy wasn't avoidance, but choice. We'd built something separate from the past, and I wanted to keep it that way. One evening, we sat on the balcony watching the city lights. He handed me a mug of tea and said, without looking at me, "I'm glad I met you the way I did." It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was better, honest, simple, unpolished. I smiled into my cup because I knew what he meant. The chaos had brought us together, but the calm had kept us there. The revenge had been sharp, satisfying in its moment, but fleeting. This, the quiet mornings, the unspoken understanding, the laughter without performance, this was lasting. I didn't need Ivy's downfall to feel like I'd won. The real victory was knowing I'd stepped out from under her shadow and into something I hadn't even been looking for. And for the first time in years, My life wasn't about what she'd taken from me. It was about what I'd found for myself. Do you think I was right to move on once Ivy was out of my life? Or should I have pushed to make her face more consequent? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy hearing my stories with all their twists, make sure to follow so you don't miss the next one.